In 1836, a brilliant and eccentric naturalist named Constantine Rafinesque announced an astonishing discovery. He claimed to possess an ancient sacred record of the Lenape, the people also called the Delaware. It was, he said, a set of wooden tablets painted with rows of small symbols, each glyph a line of an ancient chant, and together they told an epic story of creation, a great flood, and a long migration of the Lenape from a distant land in the northwest to the rivers of the American East. He called it the Walam Olum, which he translated as the Red Record. It read like a native scripture, an American epic reaching back into the deep past, and over the century and a half that followed, it was translated and retranslated, studied by respected scholars, quoted as evidence for how the first Americans arrived, and taken up by some Lenape themselves as the story of their own origins. There was only one problem, and it did not surface fully until the 1990s when a scholar sat down and took the whole thing apart. The Walam Olum was not ancient at all. So where did this epic really come from? And how did a forgery come to speak for an entire people for 150 years? To follow that question honestly, we have to start with what Rafinesque actually claimed, and with the strange, sprawling document he produced. Constantine Rafinesque was one of the most extraordinary and exasperating figures in early American science. He was a naturalist of real talent, a man who named countless species of plants and animals and had genuine flashes of insight. But he was also famous for his wild overreach, for seeing patterns and connections everywhere, and for claims that ran far ahead of any evidence. In the 1830s, he turned his restless mind to the ancient history of the Americas, and it was in that context that he presented the Walam Olum. According to Rafinesque, the painted wooden tablets had come into his hands through an intermediary, obtained from a Lenape source, and along with the pictures, he had also acquired the words, a text in the Delaware language that the glyphs were said to record. He published the whole thing in 1836 in a book on the ancient nations of America, laying out the little drawings alongside the Delaware verses and an English translation. The content was genuinely epic in scope. It opened with the creation of the world by a great spirit, the shaping of land and life, and the coming of a serpent and a devastating flood from which the people were saved. Then it unfolded a vast migration, a roll call of dozens of chiefs, one after another across the generations, each with a name and a deed, guiding the Lenape on a centuries-long journey across the continent from a frozen land in the far northwest, over a great water, and down at last to the rivers of the east. It had the shape of a real national saga, a beginning, a catastrophe, and a long wandering toward a homeland, told in the cadence of verse and illustrated by its rows of little painted figures. For a young country hungry for an ancient past of its own, and for scholars eager to understand where native peoples had come from, it was electrifying. Here, seemingly, was a native people's own written account of their deepest origins, a document to set beside the migration epics of the Old World. And for a very long time it was believed, which is the part that makes this story matter. This was not a crank pamphlet that everyone ignored. The Walam Olum was taken seriously by serious people for generations. In the 1880s, a respected scholar of native languages named Daniel Brinton re-examined the text, produced his own translation, and published it as a genuine Lenape document, lending it real academic weight. Deep into the 20th century, teams of researchers continued to study it. In the middle of the century, a major project brought together linguists and anthropologists to re-examine and retranslate the text, publishing an elaborate scholarly edition that treated it as an authentic, if puzzling, window into the Lenape past. That is the level of seriousness the document commanded. It was not fringe material. It found its way into books, into museums, into university courses, and into the general understanding of who the Lenape were and where they had come from, repeated so often and by such respectable authorities that questioning it began to seem eccentric. Above all, it seemed to give strong support to the idea that Native Americans had migrated into the continent from Asia, across the far northwest, because that is exactly the journey the Walam Olum describes. The story was cited as if the Lenape themselves had remembered and recorded the peopling of America. And, most poignantly of all, over time, some Lenape people came to embrace the Walam Olum as their own, to see in it the voice of their ancestors and the record of their origins, folding a document handed to them by outsiders into their sense of themselves. That is what makes the truth about it so serious, and it is exactly the point where an honest documentary has to stop retelling the epic and start testing it. If you enjoy slow documentaries that take a famous historical document seriously enough to actually check whether it is real, consider subscribing, because it genuinely helps these longer videos reach the people who like them. Because when the scholar David Oestreicher finally examined the Walam Olum with fresh and skeptical eyes, the whole thing came apart in his hands. The first and simplest problem is the one that should have troubled everyone from the start. The original painted tablets, the physical objects at the very heart of the claim, were never actually produced. No one independently examined them, no museum held them, and they cannot be found. From very early on, all anyone really had was Rafinesque's own copies of the glyphs and his own text, which means the entire foundation of the document rests on the word of a single man known for extravagant claims. Think about how unusual that is for a document treated as a national epic. There was no artifact to date, no wood to examine, no independent witness who had handled the tablets and could vouch for them. Rafinesque said they had passed through his hands and then were gone, leaving only his transcription behind. In any other field, an ancient text that survived solely as one eccentric collector's copy, with the originals conveniently vanished, would be treated with the deepest caution. That alone should have kept the Walam Olum under suspicion, and for some skeptics it always did, but the sheer richness and appeal of the story carried most readers past the doubt. But the decisive blow came from the language itself, and this is the heart of Oestreicher's case. When Oestreicher, working in the 1990s, studied the Delaware text closely, he found that it did not behave like a real, living oral epic in the Delaware language. Instead, it read like something assembled backward. The words and phrases appeared to have been pulled from existing published sources on the Delaware language, the dictionaries and grammars and word lists that European and American scholars had compiled, and then strung together, often in a garbled, ungrammatical way that a fluent speaker would never have produced. In other words, the ancient Lenape chant looked exactly like what you would get if someone who did not truly speak Delaware had written a story in English and then translated it word by word into Delaware using a dictionary. The seams showed. The specific fingerprints were there to be found. Phrases lined up with entries in the very dictionaries and word lists that Christian missionaries and earlier scholars had compiled of the Delaware language, as though someone had gone shopping for words in those books and pinned them together in a row. The grammar was the grammar of a non-speaker leaning on a reference book, not the fluent speech of a people's sacred chant. And the pictures told the same tale. The little glyphs, rather than forming a coherent native writing system, appeared to have been adapted and copied from illustrations Rafinesque could have found in the books of his day, images and symbols drawn from many unrelated traditions around the world, blended into something that looked ancient but traced back to a library rather than to a Lenape hand. When you can point to the modern sources a supposedly ancient text was built from, the case is effectively closed. Put those findings together, the missing tablets, the reverse-engineered language, and the borrowed pictures, and the conclusion is nearly inescapable. The Walam Olum was not an ancient Lenape record at all. It was composed, most likely by Rafinesque himself, out of published materials, and dressed up as antiquity. The natural question is why a talented naturalist would fabricate an entire epic. And while we cannot read his mind, the pieces fit together in a familiar way. Rafinesque was ambitious, often short of money and recognition, and deeply invested in his own grand theories about the ancient peopling of the Americas. A document like the Walam Olum would serve all of that at once. It would make him the discoverer and translator of a lost native scripture. It would provide dramatic support for his ideas about ancient migrations, and it fit his lifelong habit of announcing sweeping finds that others could not check. He was, by his own record, a man who reached for the extraordinary and worried about the evidence later, a scholar who had already floated dubious readings of other supposed ancient American writings and inscriptions. There was also a world of prizes and prestige to be won in that era for anyone who could shed light on the origins of the American Indians, a question that fascinated European and American learned societies alike, and a discovery like the Walam Olum was exactly the sort of thing that could make a struggling naturalist's name. Seen in that light, the Walam Olum is not an aberration, but the largest and most damaging example of a pattern that ran through his whole career. And the reason it fooled so many careful people afterward is not hard to understand either. It told a story people wanted to be true, a native epic that fit the expected shape of a migration from Asia, and once a respected scholar like Brinton had put his authority behind it, later researchers inherited it as an established source rather than a claim to be tested. A forgery that flatters the expectations of its age, and that gets an early stamp of approval, can survive for a very long time before anyone thinks to look underneath it. And this is where the story stops being a curiosity about a dead naturalist and becomes something that matters to living people, because a forgery like this does real harm, and naming that harm is part of telling the truth. For a century and a half, the Walam Olum put words into the mouths of Lenape ancestors that they never spoke, and told the Lenape story in a voice that was not theirs. It shaped how outsiders understood the Lenape, and it even reshaped, for some, how the Lenape understood themselves, so that a document manufactured by a 19th century outsider became tangled up with a real people's sense of their own origins. There is a particular cruelty in that, in a forged scripture being handed to a people as their own inheritance. And it is important to be gentle here, because the Lenape who embraced the Walam Olum did nothing wrong. They received it in good faith, from scholars and books that presented it as authenticated, as their own ancestral record recovered and returned to them, and it is entirely understandable that a people robbed of so much would hold close a document that promised to give a piece of their deep past back. The fault lies with the forger, and with the long chain of authorities who failed to check his work, never with the people who trusted them. And it matters that the correction has come, and that the Lenape have been part of it. In recent decades, as the evidence of forgery became clear, the Delaware community itself has confronted the Walam Olum and come to recognize it as a hoax rather than a genuine ancestral record, reclaiming the right to say what is and is not their own history. The obvious and important point is the one to hold on to. The exposure of the Walam Olum as a fake takes nothing away from the Lenape. It takes away something that was never theirs to begin with. The real Lenape are living people, the Lenni Lenape, whose homeland lay along the Delaware and Hudson rivers in what is now New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, southern New York, and Delaware. Their true history is dramatic enough without any invention. They were among the first peoples to meet European colonists on the Atlantic coast. They were cheated of their land in notorious dealings such as the fraudulent walking purchase of the 1700s, and over the generations that followed, they were pushed step by step westward, from the Delaware Valley into the Ohio country, then on to Indiana, Missouri, Kansas, and finally Indian Territory, one of the most repeatedly displaced nations in North America. And still they endured. Today their descendants form recognized nations far from the Atlantic, the Delaware tribe of Indians, and the Delaware Nation in Oklahoma, the Stockbridge-Munsee community in Wisconsin, and Munsee and Delaware communities in Ontario, along with others, carrying genuine traditions, ongoing work to keep their language alive, and a real history that does not need a forged epic to be deep and worthy of respect. The true story of endurance is far more moving than any painted tablet Rafinesque ever claimed to hold. Giving back a people's voice sometimes means clearing away the false words that were put in their mouths. None of the honest questions here are truly unanswered. We cannot fully read Rafinesque's private motives, and a few small details of how he worked remain uncertain. But we can separate the solid ground from the fabrication. Here is what nobody who checks the evidence seriously disputes. Constantine Rafinesque published the Walam Olum in 1836 as an ancient Lenape record of creation, flood, and migration. The original painted tablets were never produced, never independently examined, and cannot be found. The Delaware text appears to have been assembled backward from existing dictionaries and grammars rather than composed by a fluent speaker, and the glyphs were adapted from published sources. The document was believed and studied for over a century, gaining authority from scholars like Daniel Brinton, before David Oestreicher demonstrated in the 1990s that it is a forgery, and the Delaware community has come to reject it as a hoax. Those are the solid stones. Here is where the small questions remain. We do not know with certainty every step of how Rafinesque built the document, or exactly what mixture of ambition, theory, and self-deception drove him. We do not know every hand through which it passed on its way into 150 years of belief. But we do know it is not an ancient Lenape chronicle, and that question is closed. Look for the real Lenape today, and you will not find them in Rafinesque's painted sticks. But you will find them in living communities that carry their own name for themselves, their own language work, and their own history of a homeland lost and a people who endured. The epic in the tablets was invented. The people it was fastened onto are entirely real and still here. History is rarely settled by a single document, and some documents turn out to be worth less than the paper they were printed on, no matter how long they are believed. It is assembled slowly, one tested claim, one exposed forgery, one voice returned to its rightful owner at a time, and sometimes the most respectful thing a documentary can do is to say clearly that a beloved story is false, precisely so that the real people at the center of it can be seen. The Walam Olum sits in that space, the epic invented, the tablets never real, the Lenape themselves still here and still speaking for themselves. The record was forged. The tablets never existed. The Lenape endure, and they speak for themselves. Thank you for sorting the true from the false with me. If you would like more of these, the kind that clear away a forgery to reveal the real people underneath, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what this whole channel is for. Until then, a question worth sitting with. When a forged scripture can speak for a real people for 150 years, what does it say about the rest of us? That we so easily believed a stranger's invention over the living voices of the people it was written about?